All right. We are live. Welcome to the Dev Talk Show, the all-remote edition. You've got the three of us, not even in the same states. I don't think we're in the same counties even. But I'm still in Pennsylvania. I'm Chris Gomez. We've also got Andy Schwamm.
Hello.
And we have Rich Ross.
Hey, guys.
And so thanks, everybody, for getting together and being able to have this show, even though we're not in our lavish Microsoft MTC Malvern studio with the beautiful view out the back. That's may or may not be accurate.
Yeah,
may or may not be real.
Night.
So thanks, everybody, for joining us. We already had a first in the chat as our friend Bruno Juliao is here, and he's always supportive. He was here for your stream earlier today, Andy. You came on and coded today on Schwammy Streams. I see it. When I see that, I rhyme it with whammy.
That's the first time you've done that in a while.
It's been a while.
You've been accurate on Schwammy. Yeah, Bruno was on the show with us today. Thanks for being with us on Schwammy Streams, which is at 12 noon Eastern Time on Wednesdays, on here on Mixer and also on Twitch and YouTube.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. So, I got to check out a little bit of it today, too. So that was great. So
thanks for joining.
We talked a couple weeks ago about dev practices. And the reason why it came about is because we said, when you work on a team, your team might produce some kind of guide, like a standards guide of some kind. And Andy, you were working on a comprehensive one. It wasn't just coding standards, like whether you should use certain casing or tabs versus spaces. You were well past that. You were all about team productivity, and you had a lot of different. We talked about a lot of different topics there, but one of them was actually guidance for architecting the app. So tonight, our show is called Architecture Planning for Your App Success. And I think part of the reason I came up with the title is because that's the reason why we have application architecture to begin with, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's important to find a design that solves certain problems that you might have.
Yeah, I mean, if we could all just code, and it would be fine, then we wouldn't need any of it.
Yeah, it would be nice, and to some degree, it's easier if you all just code. It's easier in the moment if everybody just codes. Like right now, it's just easier to code. That comes back and bites you again later, I think, when it's time to maintain the application or when you want to collaborate or hand it off to another developer who's on the team or on a different team, those kind of things.
Right. So, I've got a comic up that I remember. I've seen it a few times called, it says The Life of a Software Engineer. I don't know. Have you seen this comic, Andy? I've got it on my screen.
Before I say that, I got to find out. Rich, are you hearing his voice and do you have an effect on your voice all of a sudden, or are we having audio problems?
He got, he bulked up a bit.
Did it all of a sudden?
It sounds deep like this.
Yeah. Chris smash.
I'm not sure what I did. It wasn't on purpose.
It's awesome, is what it is.
Is it?
Yeah, Rich can't stop laughing. Look at Rich. He's hysterical.
Am I hearing it out?
Oh,
I wondered if maybe it was coming out.
No, it comes and goes. It comes and goes a little bit.
That's weird.
Okay.
That is so funny. Well, that's the joy the joy, the magic of this remote streaming thing that we're trying to do live, where we're not in our studio, where Rich usually keeps his thumb on all the controls and everything is perfect, and now we're trying to mix it up. You were asking me to go to your screen though, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Have either of you seen this comic before? Gosh, it's been years.
Let's take a look at that. I'm going to look at it now. It says, The Life of Software Engineer. Clean slate, solid foundations. This time I will build things the right way. Yeah. Now much later, oh my, I've done it again, haven't I?
Right.
Yeah, been there.
And right, we've been there, right? And so part of your focus on architecture is to avoid the panel on the right. So I think that's the goal. Is you if you get the chance at a clean slate, or actually, it's not even just about clean slates too. It's also
redesigning and refactoring your app back to a good foundation, right?
Yeah, it's hard to get it back. I mean, you really want to start off right. You can get it back, but that's harder, right?
It's much more challenging to get it back.
Right.
I think part of the conversation is, don't over-engineer at the beginning, right? You want to get, it's much easier to take things apart than it is to try and put them back together after you've pulled them apart from an architecture perspective.
Yeah, don't over-engineer from the beginning. I think that's true within some level of reason, right?
Yeah.
Like, you don't want to just throw everything up against the wall, but you're right. You don't even know what problems you're going to have later. You don't know the demands and things like that. Maybe you do, but a lot of times you don't.
Yeah. I mean,
Chris Vader. See what Bruno wrote? Chris Vader.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't. It's funny. I don't hear anything different here, but
it is different.
I wonder what I bumped.
It's so hard to keep track. It's so hard to keep serious. It's awesome. We should all get effects. I've seen people put those kind of effects on their voice when they're doing streams. Jeff Fritz does some stuff too. The other day he had some really funny voice on it. It was really funny. But yeah, I digress. Right? I don't want to go too far because we're trying to keep this moving. And Chris is looking around. So yeah,
I was trying to figure out what it is. Go ahead.
Yeah, while he's looking at that, I really want to say, we talked about this last week, but and we're talking about maybe showing some examples of the kind of stuff that I have my team's doing. Mm-hmm. But it does not mean that what I'm doing is right for anyone else but me. Like not necessarily. It might be right for you, but you don't just adopt these kind of strategies or designs like that for no reason. And so that's what I really want to say is you should always pick an architecture or design. And by the way, sometimes those words can mean different things, architecture and design and stuff like that. But putting them all together, you want to pick something that helps you solve a problem. And going back to what we said before about just not having anything, well, then the problem is chaos, right? So the first step is like, all right, we have something. We want to follow some kind of pattern. And because the problem we're trying to solve is chaos. After that, it's like, well, what problem are you trying to solve? And going back to what we said last week, the problem I'm usually trying to solve, and I really want to hear if this makes sense and resonates with you guys and with people on the stream, the problem I try to solve more often than anything else is code readability and code maintainability, right? It's not that we're trying to make the application faster because applications are generally fast unless you do something weird. And we might have some problems with performance and we can fix those. But generally speaking, all the design stuff that I look at is how do we make it easy to build the application, easy to maintain the application, and of course, easy to test the application, which I think goes hand in hand with both of those things. Does that resonate with you guys? Does that make sense?
I'll throw out there that I hear that, and I think that's more like the underlying tenets you want to have for whatever it is you're trying to build.
Yep.
But I don't know that necessarily has to map to an architecture pattern or a principle, right? And maybe I'm overthinking it.
Well, so again, I think some of this, the term architecture could be a gray area. When I talk about application architecture or design, I'm talking about sort of a standard practice. I don't even know if it's the right word, right? But it's a standard way that applications work in similar patterns. And so part of it is even the layout of the solution and the projects and things like that, right? That's sort of like design, right? In architecture, we talk about the layers of an application. Now, I'm not talking about tiers. We could talk about tiers. Chris, I'm still sharing your screen if you want me to be.
No, go ahead.
You want me to switch it back or keep it on you?
You can switch it. Either way.
It's up to you. I'll switch it. So the and then the architecture we use is sort of like the way we build out various layers and the way different pieces of the application talk to each other. But again, I'm not talking about tiers, or I'm not even talking about, in this case, like the way different servers talk to each other, but I'm talking about the way I'm going to try to use a word that's component and not a C# type of word, but a generic word, but like the components of the application, how they are structured, and how data will flow up and down through an application, something like that. It's kind of hard to put into words, but it's very much an application. So I'm talking about like within a DLL or set of DLLs and things like that. But I'm not talking about like system or enterprise architecture in any way. At least not in this conversation. I'm not, and
Yeah, and I think your comment around how data flows and how where data resides and those kind of things, I think that is more more along the lines of where I think of. So I think that's a common ground between our thinking here.
I think what you had said last time, Andy, is that
He's back.
for the kind of applications your team has to build,
Yep.
that you and your team have I don't want to say discovered, but you have settled on a pattern that if you lay out your app this way, meaning here's where you draw lines of separation, that you've been very successful with it. And I think that kind of planning is important, because that way, if the app is easy to understand and easy to maintain, naturally a business is going to come along and say, we want something new. We want you to do something. We need to change something because the world has changed. Or maybe a customer of ours is asking for something special.
Right.
So if you just go out and code, then you often find that it's hard later to come back and say, okay, how do we make that change? You might even get scared of changing it. Now, I don't think anybody here is saying that what we're going to talk about tonight is straight out of like a classic book, like Patterns of Application Architecture or anything, or Enterprise Patterns or anything like that. That's not what it is. We could have that show, but this one is more, okay, Andy's done some work here in figuring out what's an interesting way to lay out an app. Maybe we can discuss it and learn a little bit from it, right?
I hope so. And again, I'm not saying that what I've got here is right. I'm hoping to learn something too. I'm hoping to hear, I either gain validation from you guys or I tweak it and we change it a little bit, because these things do evolve over time, and I want it to be as sort of clean and easy to follow as possible. So, I could show you some stuff if you'd like.
Yeah, I think that'd be good.
So first off, let me say that I think the easiest way to show this is to show what not to do first, right? It really sets the stage, because so let me switch over to my screen, and I have Visual Studio open here, right? And I've got this now. I can't really run this application, because what I realized about a half hour before this conversation, we knew we were going to talk about this, is that I did not have a sample that I could show really well that didn't have my company's name and things like that all over it. I was like, uh-oh. So I quickly copied a bunch of stuff and changed things, and I got it pretty close, but it probably doesn't run, but that's okay, because I don't think it really needs to run. But what I start out, and I've been showing this to people in our organization as I show different developers. We're actually just sort of new. We're rolling this out. It's this sort of design is in probably 3 or 4 teams are using it already, or at least starting to, and 2 of them are new. So the easiest way to show what not to do, this is what I show people, is I have a web application and I have a controller. And the idea here behind this controller is the membership controller. So someone wants to join a website or something like that, right? A typical thing we do. I just try to take a very generic concept and try to recreate it. And so what we have here is the method called create. So membership controller.create. And I'll just go through little bits and pieces of this thing, but we take in some criteria, right? A user that we're going to add to the system. This doesn't really matter too much, but the user can go back and forth. And so if there's errors, the user might have errors that get returned to the UI. And this is a way to just clear them off in case something's coming back from the UI. So what do we typically do next, right? The typical thing we do next is we validate the input, right? protecting our application, making sure that we're validating the input. And so now I've got these really stupid rules in here. I think we can all agree that these are dumb rules, but the username has to be, can't be less than 25 characters. I have no idea why. Again, just, I'm trying to put things in here to make this something. Believe it or not, we're saying it has to be an email address. So if it doesn't have an A, it is an @ symbol. It's not an email address. And I'm checking to see that it's a valid email address. You have to be at foobar.com. It's just silly stuff. Okay. When a user comes in, they also have a role that they're being assigned. The 2 roles we allow are somebody and somebody else. Yeah, good stuff, right? And so we have some validation there, right? And again, if any of these things happen, we're going to add some error messages and we're going to kick that back out to the view, right? Really standard stuff. The next thing you'll see happening is that we have to see if the user exists in the database yet. So I'm going right to my DB context. Again, this is what I shouldn't be doing, but I'm going to go right to my DB context just to see if that username is taken already or something like that. And so if we come back with an existing user, we return a message that the user exists. The next thing I do is I take that criteria or whatever that is, that DTO, I'm calling it there, that came in, and I'm just going to convert it into what commonly referred to as a domain. In this case, it's an entity from Entity Framework, right? This user class. And so I set a couple values on it. I call it DB context users.add. I call it DB context save changes. And then, like any good application, I'm going to notify the user and say, welcome to our company or our website. And so I'm going to go and I'm going to format this really beautiful email. And then I'm going to send it. And this is just, doesn't do anything, but this pretends to send the email out. And then I go back to the list, right? And this is just a common pattern, I think, right? I mean, how often do we build applications that take data, validate data, transform data, save it, and maybe even do something afterwards, right? Seems like a typical scenario, right? So,
Right.
So this part of the thing can kind of go hand in hand with any demo you've ever seen on solid design principles, right? This is not single responsibility at all, right? So what I would say is, again, we're going to go to a solid design, and my application design is really built upon solid as like its foundation, right? So the first thing we want to do is we want to get out this validation logic and put it into something that can do that for us, right? I mean, this isn't a surprise to you guys, right?
No.
Right? What I'm saying, right? So then we're going to validate that the role is valid, right? Then, and so obviously we could take a look at that, and I have an after project here. Let's see, after. And so in the after project, by the way, I'll just sort of jump around a little bit. If you look at the controller, I don't think the controller does it. I didn't even add the controller. I never got that far. Well, it's okay because the controller doesn't do anything. All the controller does is calls the backend. And what I do is, so this is where my naming convention, sort of my design starts to come to play, right? I like to have these. First of all, I'll go to it backwards. I find it doing it backwards sometimes helps. I set up these little folders, and I call these things mini services, right? I think that if we put terminology on things that make sense to our organization, we're all talking about the same thing. They're not called mini services. That's not some published concept or anything like that. Matter of fact, I used to call them microservices, but that name got stolen because microservices became such a thing, right? And these are not microservices, right? I'm not calling out to external services or anything like that. So what I do is, and again, this is part of what we call our standards. In our standards, we have standards. We say you are going to name this mini, right? Now that may seem like a strict thing to actually tell users developers how to name the folder, but by doing that, when we start talking about these things, when one developer says, "Hey, I'm having a problem with a service I wrote," what do you mean? Oh, well, it's a mini service. It's just a small. We know immediately that means that it's going to be a little validator that looks like this, and there's a username validator, single responsibility, and all we did is pretty much take that code out of the other page and put it into here, right? Hang on a second. Yeah, I'm talking loud, so I just got Can you guys still hear me okay?
Got to be
We're
quieter
good.
in the
Yeah,
library.
I was talking pretty loud, I think. I agree with that. Actually, I think my wife was right on that one. So anyway, so we have these little things. We call them mini services, right? And we have groups of things like validators and formatters, just the kind of stuff I was talking about earlier. And I don't want to go into every level of detail here, but I was talking about how we had a formatter that created the email, or a converter that might take the user and turn it takes the DTO and turns it into a domain object, right? And this is it, as simple as can be. Simple little, easily testable class. So if we have these mini classes or mini services, what we need is something that's going to organize it all and keep track of it. We call them orchestrators, right? Following something like the orchestrator or orchestration pattern, and I think it's pretty close to this. And as you can see, we injected all these mini services into here. And then the, where was that add user method that we saw before, really just calls all of these mini services. And again, I'm not going to go into every level of detail on this, but does that make sense?
Yeah, so what I'm seeing here, and let me just try to restate it to see if I've got it right, is in the mini services, they're like modules, but you've even defined types of them. Instead of just saying like, hey, let's just throw modules of code in here, you already in your mind have, I need to validate data. I need to format data. So these are standard procedures that you've already uncovered. You've discovered that time and again, I have to do these things.
Yeah.
And then the orchestrator, it feels kind of like in maybe you would call this, if somebody just did file a new project, ASP.NET MVC, started coding away, this is what would end up in the controller, I think. This
is what the controller would call.
Well, what I mean is let's say you don't do any of this.
Oh, yeah.
You're like, I'm just gonna code, right? I want to get this working. And so a lot of times this is what ends up in the controller. You just slam in, just like you did in your first example.
The first example, that's what I was showing you. This is the way we used to write apps. I used to write apps like this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
All the code was right here in the controller. Yep.
By moving it to your orchestrator, interesting thing there is that now that assembly, you could take that and you could build a WinForms app.
That's the idea.
Or you could switch, or it could be a service that does this. Or I want to try out Blazor. Fine. I've got this separated in your backend project. So you've tried to say, I want to make sure I keep the work to be done separate from really, the web project, which is more about taking in user input, putting stuff back on in output, stuff like that. So again, if anybody's here saying like, hey, are we going to learn about some specific architecture pattern? Like, oh, what are some of the sums we see is like the onion architecture and things like that. That's not what it's about. This is a pattern that's worked for you that you've even used to do a workshop on, the end-to-end.
That's right.
Chinese patterns. And it was I never got to see it because I was usually doing other stuff at Code Camp. So I guess part of what I'm asking is this is what we're getting, right? We're getting the quick version.
Yeah, that's kind of what you're getting.
Cool.
That's
funny. Awesome.
Sometimes I forget that I used to do that talk. And so you're right. We do have these folders with things like converters, and we'll talk about some of these other ones, formatters. I'm emphasizing with the team that like, let's use these names. Now there's going to be more. You might have something like you have 12 different ways of notifying your users or something like that. You may have like a notifiers folder, right? I don't know what you might have, but you might. But what I'm saying is, let's use the term converter instead of some teams calling it adapters and some teams calling it converters and all these things. If we have some consistency, it's going to make it really easy when we want to help each other out.
Yeah.
So what we call, then we call these top level things orchestrators. And we've been through different names on some of these things, to be honest with you. And I find that getting the name right is really important. And there's a couple other pieces that's like the basics of this whole thing, right? Now, the other important parts is that, and let me show you an example here. If I had a method here, like I can change this, right? Let's say I called it, well, let's pretend that this thing takes some criteria, right? So we have a method called get users, and well, this is probably going to be a list of users. And maybe this isn't the best example because I'm thinking it off the top of my head. But we have a method called get users async, and it returns this list of users. So what happens if, or the better one actually, sorry, let me clarify that a bit because I want to use a better example here. Let's go back to add user. And if add user returns a user DTO, something like this. I don't know. Again, I don't have the best example here. So what happens if this fails? Okay, now you could argue that we could throw an exception or something like that. What happens if it returns null? Does that mean that the user didn't get added or that the user already existed? Like there's not a lot of information coming back.
Right.
So the pattern we like to use is to, let me see, I have it somewhere in here under, let's see, wait, hang on, because I just threw this whole thing together. Well, what we like to do is we like to return 3 things back from every method, right? I like to return success, which is a Boolean. I like to return a potential list of messages, and I like to return the data, right? The user or whatever it is. Okay?
The object.
The object, right? So what we do is we use what we call them like result objects, right? So it's a result object that has these 3 properties, okay? And the data, of course, would be user DTO. Now, we don't want to make a new one for every time we need a user DTO. So we use generics, and it's really, really pretty simple. So we use generics, and I think I have it down in this like common folder here because I just grabbed these things. So there's a thing called a result object, and you can see that it has the success and it has these messages, and this is the abstract class, right? And if I go like a select result, which would have data coming back, this one has a generic data property, right? So now that lets me do all the things I want to do. And so what we've done is if I go back here, let's undo all that. Oh, look at all those control Z's. Subsequent training. Whoa, I don't want to do that.
That's cool though. So if anybody watching didn't know Control Z was undo, that's a great. I know you've been using that tool on your streams too.
Yeah, I like this tool
on,
that shows me what to do. So you can see here that in this case, I'm returning this user DTO as part of a persist result. Okay.
And just because you didn't mention it this time, and I asked about it on your stream earlier, that tool is Karnak?
Karnak, yeah. Yes. It's really super lightweight. You just kind of throw it on there and it does some cool stuff. So, so the other thing you'll see, so all of my orchestrators return something like a persist result or a select result or something like that. Again, that's part of the pattern that we're saying this is the way to do it. Because 9 times out of 10, when you just return something like a user DTO, someone's going to add something, even if you didn't have any, I don't know, any other reason to have it, you're going to need it sooner or later or something like that. It's just pretty standard. And then when we build our clients that call these things, we just know that our client is going to have those, the result is going to have those properties coming back. You'll also notice that we use async. Okay. This is part of the way we're trying to lay this out. Just use async. Do you guys agree with that? We're saying just use async for pretty much everything, especially when it's data. Like these are data access calls. These should have async. And let me just say that I used to do both. I would have add user async and I would have add user. And what I'm getting at is we just stopped with the add user, like make it async.
Right. Because usually whatever it is, even where you have there at line 81, your method that winds up calling out to that other service is going to have some kind of a weight around it anyway.
Well,
typically, right?
Yes. And so what I mean is that when I used to just have add user, I would have to have this data service would have to have a get user without an async on it. Like you had to build doubles of everything, right?
No,
and I just don't see the reason to do that anymore.
Nope.
But async is so easy. So I just say, go for it. Put async in. And then the other thing, I guess, just there's a couple other pieces of this that I want to talk about. The first is that you'll see that my methods take things like DTOs and return things like, that are what we're calling DTOs. And I'm using that very generically. DTO, data transfer object, doesn't really mean much of anything. But what it means to my organization is that it is not a domain object, right? And again, that's another one of those terms that could mean different things to different people. But if we're using the entity framework, which we are right now, I'm saying it's not an entity. We don't allow our real data objects, whatever they are, the ones that go into the database or into storage, we don't allow those to go out to the customer or to the client, because the client should get something that is exactly what they need and not something they don't need. So a user that goes to the database may have 55 fields, and it may have things like last edited by and last update date and things like that. We always turn things into some kind of DTO, or we use VMs for certain things as well. And but the point is, we have these boundaries where DTOs are accessible and boundaries where an entity is accessible. And you'll always see something like a converter to domain, and then that gets passed into the data service, things like that. So that's one of our sort of tenets of our design. Another thing, and you guys just jump in anytime if I'm going too far here. Another thing is the use of these data services. I'll talk about that in a minute. And another thing is the way we use the unit of work pattern, which is to say that you wouldn't know, like just by looking at this, like if my application looked like this, right? You could think that add user actually adds the user. And what I mean by that is like commits the transaction, right? And does it. But in our design, it will never do that. Well, that's not true. There's an override that you can actually force it to. But generally speaking, we want to do this because we don't know if you might do something like that, right? And if this user works and this user fails for whatever reason, we'd like to be able to roll back. So we have a unit of work, and that unit of work is always in the orchestrator and not in a lower area. And another thing is, many people would say, what do you need a unit of work for? Because we have entity framework, and we know that entity framework has something like, and I'm just winging it here, because I don't know if, sorry, let's say, I think you can do DB context, whatever your DB context is, right? Save changes.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
I don't like that at all. Right. Now, this would probably be something like a user DB context or something like that. Right. I don't like this at all.
Why?
And the reason is because if I do that, you can also do this, user DB context. Well, the DB context is like your whole database, right? So let's just call this the application DB context, right? And if I can do that, then why don't I just go right in here and say customers dot add X, right? And in other words, this gives me like what I call like Uber access to everything in the database, right? It invalidates the whole point of having a structure where we want to have layers and have a repository pattern. And I'll explain a little bit more about the data service. But to me, as soon as you do this, it breaks the entire model. Now, I'm certainly not against entity framework. Matter of fact, this whole thing is built on entity framework. I just don't like doing this. To me, and here's a tricky thing, and this is where I want to get you guys' thoughts on this. There are times when I say, like, I'm a big fan of public methods. I don't like private methods. People used to say, well, private methods prevent your developers from using them in the wrong places or something like that, right? And I'm going to say, well, I trust the developers not to use them in the wrong places, right? Like, sort of, right? If you get what I'm saying there. But then you say, why don't I just trust developers not to go right to the DB context, right? Because I recognize that there's a little bit of a conflict there. You could say, well, so what? Tell the developers not to use it. But as far as I'm concerned, this is really tempting, right? This is just begging you to take shortcuts and break the pattern. And because of that, I have this unit of work that essentially just wraps the DB context, right? but it doesn't expose all those other DB sets and things like that. What do you guys think? Does that resonate?
Well,
or is it overkill?
so I think a lot of people go back and forth here because it depends on, well, one thing it depends on is if you want this code to be so knowledgeable about Entity Framework.
And I don't. So you're right about that.
So but that's not necessarily what you're asking, because you could implement, I mean, you could have, are you asking, what if my pattern was just a save changes? I mean, you're not quite doing that because you have that unit of work. That's not the same thing as save changes. You're basically saying, hey, whatever I've done in the data service, now go do it. Now go persist that.
Well, that's what save changes does. I mean, that's what this method would do if I was using a DB context, right? It's the same concept.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm really not doing anything different. Well, there's one thing that I'm doing that's a little different, which is to say that the unit of work in this case might actually have multiple contexts within it. And this will save across multiple DB contexts, but we don't do that often. I'm mostly just trying to keep that, like you said, the entity framework stuff shouldn't be something that the orchestrator needs to know about. You could envision a scenario where you have different developers that work at different levels of the thing, and maybe you have certain developers that work on the EF type of code or the data repository kind of code, and other developers that work on the top layers. There's a lot of reasons why you might want to separate it, but I just like it because I think it helps keep the pattern clean.
So I noticed a little earlier, I found the result interesting. How basically you went along the path of saying, hey, just returning a value isn't good enough, because if something goes wrong, you don't get any information. And sure, you could throw exceptions, but you eventually decided, I want a way to tell whether or not I should trust the value. And then maybe I know that your second property was messages. I presume sometimes those messages are errors.
Yeah.
But they don't have to be, which I think is why you called it messages. What's funny is you see a lot of functional programmers go this route. This is very common, like in F# to say, hey, here's a result, and it's a union of these things. And I feel like you're starting on that journey toward realizing that you want to know. You don't just want to know. You don't just want a value back. You want a safe way to know what happened and whether you should trust and use it before you just dive in and use it and get a null reference exception. So yeah. I just find that interesting, because I'm not saying that you've exactly implemented this, but it would be very similar to like F# option, where you get back this option, and the option object itself helps you. When you go to read it out, it wouldn't bother reading anything out if the option says there's nothing in here. Like option is just a fancy word for like, there might be something in here, there might not be, but you've implemented that.
That's cool.
Like a code bag. What do we used to call those? Property bag. That's
property bag. Yeah, it's something.
It's like that. Yeah. So I think it'll be interesting. I think if some of the C#8 and some of the futures for C#, like discriminated unions or records, come into play. And look, those features have been sitting there in C# proposal land. They were there for C#7. They were there for C#8. They're sitting there for C#9. There's people championing them. If one of them finally breaks through, I would be really interested to see if you're like, wait a second, that's what we do with our results. I mean, we'll see.
That's cool.
But I think that's really interesting. Now, another thing I was curious about is you have kind of a standard way of doing modules, but I noticed that you don't seem to have a base interface for them. So the orchestrator, you're willing to derive it off of iMembership Orchestrator, but I didn't feel like you say, hey, all orchestrators follow this pattern because maybe you found that wasn't valuable. I don't know. Or maybe you just don't do it that way.
So yeah, you're right. The point of the interface that we have here is a little bit more for dependency injection and mocking and those kind of things, right? We don't enforce some kind of orchestrator interface or orchestrator base class. In this case, I think because the orchestrator really can be, they can each be quite different from each other. I'm not sure. Now I do use some base classes in a couple other places and a couple other things where we have a little bit more structure around it, especially when you get down to the repository layers and things like that. But I don't see the need to do that, you know. At least I haven't found it yet. Now, I think if we had a lot of similar, again, I'm showing simple generic examples, right? Simple use cases. I think in real world applications, you may find, wow, we've got several of these orchestrators that are an awful lot alike. And maybe in that case, you know, the use for some base class or something like that would be helpful. But I don't know. I don't see I haven't come up with that use case yet.
No, those are just some of the observations I had, is that, you know, I'm not saying that you should.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if maybe you discovered that having an I orchestrator didn't really buy you anything. And if not, that's fine too. It's just that you wouldn't be shocked to see somebody doing an in-depth like code, hey, you know, separation of concerns talk, and like really dive in and drill in, where I feel like you have been making pragmatic choices over the years. You might have tried something and then pulled back, or just said like, I just don't see the value, you know, this isn't that much repetitive code. And at the same time, it doesn't require some person to learn this whole entire base class and base interface library just to make a quick change.
Yeah, I think so. I do try to be pragmatic, and the other thing I'm sort of aware of with these kind of patterns is that at a certain point, and maybe this, you know, some people would say, well, who cares, right? But I think at a certain point, developers don't want to have this overstructure and have to learn a whole library, like just to be able to write some code. They want to be creative. That, you know, so I try to keep that in mind all the times and say, let's just put in what we have to have, you know, what we need to make things easy for them, to make things consistent with them. So I don't know. That's just something that that I try to be aware of, having been a developer for many years, right? Yeah, I try to be pragmatic. So like you talk about, like, did I have an orchestrator, an I orchestrator, or a base orchestrator? So the only time my way of discovering these things, like you were saying, like patterns are discovered, right? Someone once said, that's not my quote, I don't know where that comes from, but you know, patterns aren't invented, they're discovered, right? So the need for a membership orchestrator, like I wouldn't want to think about that first. Like I shouldn't be saying, hey, I should have a membership a base orchestrator. What I should discover is that I've made 10 of these and they're all the same in a certain way. And you know what? Hey, wow, I just discovered something. I need a base orchestrator, or I need an I orchestrator interface. But I haven't discovered that. And when we do, I could see certain people, certain teams might want to have every orchestrator do something special that they all need to do, but I haven't gotten there yet. So I could show you a couple of other things if you want to see a little bit more. There's not a whole lot more to this pattern, right? I mean, I hope you're seeing that it's fairly simple. The idea is, you know, let the developers be able to do what they want to do. Keep it kind of simple. And of course, clearly this doesn't cover every circumstance, right? But the other thing I guess I want to talk about is this whole idea of a data service. And we use the repository pattern. And we use generic repositories. So our generic repositories make it really easy. Although I don't know if this one uses the generic repository. Let me just take a look at this. Go to implementation. Yeah. So I have this user repository, and yeah. Okay. So specifically for this demo, and again, I copied this code from a demo at work, but I didn't want to make this generic actually, because I think it's almost harder to talk about the repository pattern when I'm throwing all the generic stuff into it, right? So for this part, I say, well, here's what here. Oh, sorry. Wait, this is the data service. Somehow I jumped into that. Let's go to this. Go to,
See, Karnak would tell you it's Control F12 to go to implementation.
Control.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe this is generic. Wait.
See, so now you're going to try it. You're going to go
Control
F12.
F12. I never use that. Go to implementation.
Well, don't worry.
It
I
even
never have
says
either.
it.
It's just that every
Here it is.
time that you right-clicked on it, I said, oh, let me see what it is.
So I do have this, like I called it user repository simple, right? The whole point is to show that like a repository, I don't want to get into the whole repository pattern. That's a whole different thing, right? But it exposes the CRUD operations that you might want to have on a data set. And what it shouldn't have is business logic, right? So my repositories are just here, right? They're just these simple things that work. In these cases, they work off of Entity Framework, and so you see DB sets and things like that in them. And they have access to the DB context, of course, stuff like that. Now, I have a whole generic base class. This is a place where I have a whole generic base class and set of base classes for repositories. But that's not really what I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to talk about is the data service. And so when we want to get data from a data source or add data to a data source, we have the standard of saying, let's use a data service. We don't use the repository directly. The reason we don't want to use the repository directly is because of, well, this is kind of a lame example, but where I think that business logic should be not in the repository. So in this data service, you see things like filtering, right? The fact that I want to get a user by username, and I'm saying where the username equals the username, that's barely business logic, but it could be, right? But maybe we want to put in some sort of logic in here that says ignore expired users, right? And for whatever reason, we want to ignore users named Chris, right? Because you definitely want to do that, right? So
Yeah.
that's a silly example, right? But that's business logic, right? And so if I would want to see a sort of like a get, maybe a method called get valid users, right?
So you want a place
that takes into
that's separate from calling the database, that you can say, here's where I not only get data out of my persistence, we have some rules that we always apply.
and this is a place to put them, right?
Yeah.
Inside of data service. Now, the tricky part, and the place where I've gotten pushback from people, I'll be honest, right? The place where I get pushback from people at first, because again, I told you, I try to make this so it's not like too annoying for people. But in this case, all I'm really doing is getting a user, and the developer knows that. And so someone might say, well, why not just say repo, or what if I wanted everything? Why not just say repo.all or whatever my method is? Like, if there is no filtering, why use a data service, right? Why? And this is where maybe I do get strict, and I do get sort of tough or controlling, but I say always use a data service, because that's the pattern. A data service calls a repository. Repository shouldn't be used directly in an orchestrator. And again, it's just one of those things that, like I say to people, well, what was this? This data service was 2 lines of code. Like, it didn't kill you to write this. So let's follow the pattern, because there are going to be times when you want to have it, and it can get kind of sloppy and confusing. And this way, when someone else comes in to look at your application and they want to add some filtering logic, they don't have to move the repository out. They go right to the data service. That's where the filtering is. Business logic is in the repositories. Like, I just try and keep that separation. And I think that would be a place where some purists would say, No, don't do that. Don't use those data services if you don't need them.
You know, I feel like we could probably find a chart, whether it's something in like layered architecture or onion architecture, where what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep the arrows going in one direction. So this orchestrator is like to me, I even earlier compared the orchestrator to the lazy controller, where I'm new to, and I shouldn't even say new because this is totally unfair. I just threw everything in the controller, which, you know, if I'm going to build an app in 30 seconds, maybe it's no big deal, right? But for the long haul, an app where you know the business is going to come back to you again and again, asking for changes, asking for modifications, you're keeping the arrows going one way. The controller calls the orchestrator, which then calls a data service, which calls a repository. So if a change has to be made in any of these layers, you know exactly where it is, and you're not swapping out other parts or making them fit. You're not trying to make the Legos fit in a way they're not designed to. You're just like, hey, these are how these things hook up.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And the funny thing is, Chris, you talked about how you could find like a diagram with the arrows and stuff like that. I have that diagram, right? I have the Visio diagram, right, except that I realized it had my company's name on it. I was going to show it beforehand, but it's exactly what it is. The diagram just, it like shows the way the arrows go. It shows the way where our boundaries are and what some of our constraints are on some of these things. And yeah, that's just kind of what it is. And right, time and time again, the business comes back and says, "Hey, can you add another filter in there?" And it's pretty easy to do. So, but you know, I figure like I tell you the good and the bad and the ugly, and this is where I've heard from some developers who say, well, "What do I need a data service there for?" You know, I don't need that. I find it's been helpful. So,
well, I think all three of us know there's no one size way to do everything. And then even when you really start to like the way you do things, you might run into the case where you say, boy, this is a lot of extra work for no real value. I think I might break my own rules.
Yeah, sometimes you do.
Rules are meant to be broken.
What's that?
Rules are meant to be broken.
Rules are meant to be broken. Well, I do talk about the fact that like this pattern is like everything in here when we go through the standards and guidelines with developers is that everything in here can be, and you can almost say should be broken if for the right reason, right? Like, yes, break the rule if you have a reason. Don't force your application to be written poorly because Andy decided that this is the architecture that we need because your application is different, right? But what I do say is, you know, talk about that, right? Like, let's not just blindly break the rules. And if for some reason, and I try to tell people, like, if for some reason you were doing something differently, and again, it's hard to think of an example right here, but go ahead and put a comment in here and say, here's why I did this differently, right? Or like, you know, some sort of special attribute like the old does not follow standards attribute, you know, if there was such a thing. And the reason for that is because other developers are going to come in and look at your code. And this is why the data service, I want it to be consistent, because other developers are going to come in and view your code, and they're going to say, hey, this code works that way. They're calling the repo right in here. So why don't I call the repo right in here? But I'm going to add filtering logic right onto the repo or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And it's important that we have to have the ability to have differences and the ability to break the rules and color outside the lines, but do it carefully and document it a little bit when you need to. That's you know, kind of my take.
Yeah, and almost like the you know, while the coder did it, you know, I'm sure you guys have a code review as well, and that should be part of that process. It's almost like, hey, this is how I plan on doing it. You know, is it okay for this one routine for whatever reason? Yeah.
Yeah, certainly the person doing the code review should be like, whoa, this is not following the standard. And they say, well, by the way, my favorite thing in code reviews is to tell people to add comments, right? Because if I have to ask why something's happening in a code review, right, you're going to ask why 6 months from now, because you're not going to remember why you did this in your own code, you know? Now,
6 months, 6 days.
You know, I wouldn't normally even
6 hours.
I wouldn't normally even put this comment on here, this validate comment, but it was a little bit more to show how I'm taking the pieces from the that old junky monolithic sort of way and move these things into these little services and stuff like that. But you really don't need this. This code should read really nicely, right? User validator to validate. I don't need to tell you what I'm doing here. What do you think I'm doing here, right? But comments of why you're breaking the rules or why you did something different is helpful. And I think there's only, just trying to think if we have anything else. I mean, I don't want to get into the generic repositories because that's really just something different.
Well, I think repository pattern is another show.
Yeah, I love the repository.
But no, I appreciate that you shared a lot of this with us, Andy, because a lot of times we look at charts, a lot of times we look at diagrams, and then here's like, and I know you had to throw, do a lot of cutting and pasting, but say, hey, here's how I like to break things down. So it's really helpful.
So let me ask you this just question, and I think we're probably close to wrapping up this show, right?
Yeah.
Because we want to keep it on time today. But when I said application architecture, right? Because we started going down this path a little bit in the beginning. I said, well, it's sort of the way we lay out the applications and things like that. Is architecture the right word for this stuff I'm talking about in your mind?
I'll be honest, it wasn't where my head originally went.
Right. I had a feeling.
But I could be the oddball in the room, so that's fine too.
I think the term is pretty overloaded.
Right.
Some people might expect to see, are we going to talk about microservices versus monolith? But that's a different thing.
Right.
Yes, you happen to demonstrate a monolith tonight, but it doesn't have to be. Now, what you did demonstrate, I think what we really talked about a lot of it, as part of this was separation of concerns, which I think we could probably, search quite a bit. And we would see, if we just search for separation of concerns, I wouldn't be shocked at all if we find a website or a definition that says, so separation of concerns is a component of your application's architecture or something like that, where they'll put it in the same sentence.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a small part of a big whole. Then we, in an hour, we're not going to be able to replicate a whole course on architecture. It's not going to be an entire course or training or career spent doing this stuff.
Yeah, that's why sometimes I call it like the application design pattern, and what I've been calling it at work also, because I have a picture of it. Like I told you, there's a picture of it, and so what I call this is my company's implementation of the Orchestrator pattern, something like that is my way of describing it, which means I'm starting with Orchestrator, but I'm also adding some other rules and saying, well, I want you to use results, and I want you to do, so we call it sort of like our implementation of the Orchestrator pattern.
I like a lot of these things, though, because what I feel like is you're discovering a lot of things that other folks are talking about, too. So it'd be interesting to put this in our notes for other shows. Sure. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, thanks.
But I know we got to wrap it up, and I want to make sure that we mention next week. So I've got the website up right now. Everybody, if you go to blazorroadshow.com, and Blazor with an O, BLAZOR, that's the ASP.NET Core framework that I think a lot of people are excited about, and so is Carl Franklin, one of the founders and hosts of .NET Rocks. And he's going on the road, taking the Blazor Roadshow to several cities. And you can see there's a special city right here, February 12th. So Philly.net is hosting Carl Franklin's Blazor Roadshow at the Microsoft MTC, where we do this show most weeks. And he's going to be there from 6 to 9. So 3 solid hours of Carl Franklin talking about what he's learned about best practices, consuming components, even if you absolutely have to call JavaScript, which I'm sure he'll chuckle about a little bit because he does a lot on the show. And it's sponsored by our friends at DevExpress. And I think probably the absolute coolest part of this, right, is that so that show, I think it's still correct to say that will not be streamed on Philly.net.
Right.
That's correct.
So I know a lot of you know about both channels, and you know that Philly.net streams all their meetings, but this is a sponsored event, and he's going on a road show, so that will not be streamed next week. However, we will be talking with Carl live after He does the Blazor Roadshow, so it's going to be a little bit after 9. Can't give you an exact time because I'm sure he's going to be very popular. People are going to want to see him, and he might take us a few minutes to get him out of there, right? But and we are coming down to the studio, and we're going to talk with Carl Franklin as part of the Dev Talk Show. I think we'll talk a little bit about Blazor and maybe talk about community and just what we all get out of doing shows like this, which certainly, as you said at the beginning of this, Andy, I'm not sure that shows like ours would be here if it wasn't for what Carl started and Carl and Richard are doing.
That's for sure.
So don't forget to go to the devtalkshow.com and you'll see this beautiful page, which just at least reminds you when we're on.
It's terrible.
And if you don't catch us live, so like you're here with us tonight live, that's great. We're really grateful that you're here, and hope that you follow the channel or catch us next time. But if you are watching us from the future, then that means that you're watching us on YouTube and our YouTube channel. We don't quite have enough subscribers yet for the 100 mark, and in order to have some vanity URL, but it doesn't matter because I think when you switch back to the main view here, you're going to see that we're at video.thedevtalkshow.com, and it'll take you right here. So I know we're just about ready to get out of here. And I want to thank Rich for joining us from the other time zones.
He's got company now.
And Andy for
right about the right time.
And Andy for demonstrating that app architecture to us. So we'll just make this quick. Is that okay with you both?
Yeah, great.
I appreciate you both being here. Thank you both for everything. So for Andy Schwamm and Rich Ross, I'm Chris Gomez. We'll see you next week, February 12th. It'll be a little after 9. Otherwise, we're here Wednesdays at 8:30. Join us live on the Dev Talk Show. Thank you.